The Roaring Twenties, an era marked by the great juxtaposition of extreme wealth and incredible poverty. During this time, social issues were on the rise, but at the same time, many social changes occurred, which really shaped how America looks today. Through demographic changes, migrations, and increased social freedoms for certain groups, the entire scheme of what the American dream looked like changed significantly over this past decade of time. During the 1920s, the nation's expanding commercial entertainment and new technologies offered Americans an unprecedented number and variety of diversions to fill their leisure hours. Work weeks shortened, and wages and salaries rose, while the cost of living remained comparatively stable. Modern advertisements glorifying leisure and consumption encouraged self-fulfillment and happiness. Equally important was America's emergence as an urban industrial nation, a situation that changed people's attitudes towards recreation and leisure. Once considered unnecessary and even frivolous, recreation and leisure came to form a significant feature of modern life. Americans' recreation and leisure activities varied extensively during the 1920s, but also revealed sharp class divisions among participants and consumers. Some performances, such as operas, orchestral concerts, ballets, and Broadway shows, attracted affluent urban patrons, while baseball games, boxing matches, vaudeville shows, and amusement parks appealed to the working class. Generally, most forms of commercial entertainment tended to be inexpensive and within the reach of even many working-class patrons. Unlike most white working-class patrons, Jim Crow segregation restricted and in many cases prevented African Americans from participating fully in some recreational pursuits. In some ways, the growth of recreation and leisure undermined the cohesion of American families. Children and parents increasingly pursued separate forms of recreation. College life, in particular, offered young people an enormous amount of relatively unsupervised leisure time during which to attend football games, go to dances, and otherwise socialize with friends. During the 1920s, millions of young Americans consciously abandoned their parents' behavioral and moral codes and often participated in fast-changing fads in fashion, music, dancing, and speech. This new culture often disturbed ministers, educators, and conservative Americans since it was so different and so completely out of the norm that it was just plainly scary. Anyway, in the Roaring Twenties, a significant number of American families unfortunately lived on income beneath what was considered minimal to meet bare necessities, and that an overwhelming majority had virtually no discretionary income become what it took to meet those basic needs, such as decent housing, adequate diet, and proper clothing. While the vast majority of Americans saw their incomes stagnate in the 1920s, the wealthiest actually did quite well. Much of the wealth came from corporate income. High productivity in this time period led to increased corporate profits. At the very bottom, though, of the social and economic ladder were three overlapping groups: women, workers, minorities, and farmers. Wages for women who largely worked in the service sector and unskilled industries generally stagnated, reflecting the overall picture of wages and salaries, but at a lower level. Women were usually paid significantly less than men, even in the same line of work. African American workers were far more likely to be unemployed during the decade, and they tended to find work in the lowest paying jobs of industrial America, often forced to work in custodial positions. The poverty endemic to African Americans and Native Americans was partly due to their living in rural areas and being engaged in agriculture. At the same time, agriculture had, even for the white farmers, an incredible downfall. The depressed farming sector was caused by two farming factors. declining crop prices, and excessive debt. During the First World War, American farmers enjoyed skyrocketing prices for their commodities. The European sector was badly hit by the war as the food demands of the huge armies soared. But American farmers expanded their operations in response to the rising crop prices, often going into deep debt and to buy equipment and land. But unfortunately, when the war ended and European farmers began to produce again, American crop exports declined and food prices dropped significantly, meaning that most farmers were not able to pay off their debt. Farmers again found themselves unable to pay off their debts, forcing them into tenancy for some. The Great Migration. From World War I through the 1920s, over 1 million African Americans migrated from the South to northern industrial cities, marking a crucial transition in the history of African Americans, cities, and the working class. The causes for this migration to northern cities were better hopes for getting full citizenship, dreams of land ownership in the South, since they were becoming non-existent, and also major legal, physical, and social exploitation in the South. More job opportunities were available in the North thanks to the lack of immigrants as a result of World War I, and it was especially true in the industrial sector. Although when African Americans arrived in the North, they were highly disappointed because it was very different than they had heard. Jobs paid better, but they were also in horrible conditions, and there was almost no possibility of a promotion. Like most times, extreme discrimination in housing and other forms, African Americans were often forced into segregated districts, but they also faced racial violence. African Americans also contributed a lot to the migration to northern cities and culture in general, especially in cities like Chicago and the expansion of blues music and the Harlem Renaissance. This migration also marked the end of the African American reliance on agricultural independence as means for gaining full citizenship. It also reshaped political, social, and economic demographic landscape for cities, creating more diversity, especially in larger, more populated cities. Meanwhile, there was a lot of suburban migration as well. This came as a result of the growth of the automobile industry and the road network. Cities transformed into metropolitan areas, and the increase in prosperity among middle-class Americans and native-born Americans created the urge in order to get away from the immigrant-crowded cities. Also a form of nativism. The U.S. Census of 1920 revealed that for the first time ever, the majority of American population now lived in urban areas. Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey were the most urbanized states in America. Also, Los Angeles ranked up there with urbanized states. The city was really just a huge collection of suburbs in the 1920s. Additionally, population in Los Angeles was booming with a 115% increase in population from 1920 to 1930. Beverly Hills had a staggering 2,485% increase in the population from 1920 to 1930 as a result of the growth of the film community. Not only did people move to suburbs, but businesses, factories also moved away from the industrial and commercial hubs that cities had become. This move was made possible by the expansion of electrical communications grid and the spread of using trucks for transportation, causing an increase, of course, in the spread and migration of businesses and people over a wider pane of area. Anyway, the 1920s was an interesting time when most people had very, very difficult situations and some got it big. But this was a basic overview of those differences in the life of people in the Roaring '20s.